Thank you. It is good to be here in Albany. And in our first presentation, we were touching on a few of them, but we primarily were looking at a distortion called mental filter, which is where we only look at one side of the equation and not at the other side of the equation. But today, on this emotional intelligence part 2, we're going to cover 3 different distortions. We won't be able to get to all of them, but if you want to learn more about all of them, you can get some of the resources where we can go into examples of all of them later on this evening when you come. So improving emotional intelligence, and of course this is understanding if we take a look at what emotional intelligence is, one sentence that kind of encompasses it is understanding your emotions and the emotions of others and responding to those emotions how? In a healthy way. It sounds pretty simple, but as you've noticed, it can be involved. Emotional intelligence has actually been studied, and it contributes more to successful and enjoyable living than IQ does. A lot of people think that your success in life is very much dependent upon IQ. But as I've talked about yesterday, we can have a lot of high IQ kids in college that don't even make it through college. And that's because they don't have the EQ portion of things. And so emotional intelligence does contribute more to successful and enjoyable living because it also has to do with relationships. And healthy relationships, of course, are going to be very helpful for us emotionally throughout life. Since emotional intelligence is learned rather than inherited, it actually can be improved upon. And this is one of the most gratifying things that we do in our scores. Emotional intelligence, we actually do an EQ test at the beginning of every one of our programs. And then at the end of the program, we'll do another emotional intelligence test. And it's amazing the difference. In our the average EQ is 100. In the program that we just finished, I talked about last night with 25 participants with significant anxiety and depression, their average EQ coming in was 99. And so right there at where the average of humanity is. But they left at an average EQ of 128. That puts them actually in the top 15 percentile of the nation and sets them up for significant joy and happiness and a fulfilled life. In fact, one of the individuals was a 21-year-old, not the one I talked about last night, but a 21-year-old who was also having significant struggles due to traumas in his life. As well as viewing himself as a significant problem because of some things that had happened, even in regards to his family, that had been innocent mistakes that he had made, but it resulted in some pretty serious consequences. And so he was contemplating ending his life. He came in with an emotional intelligence of 62. If you had an IQ that low, you would be called mentally challenged or mentally retarded. And so we would call this individual emotionally retarded. The good news is, because the emotional intelligence is what? Learned rather than inherited, he actually left with an emotional intelligence of 154, which puts him in the top 1 percentile of the nation. He engaged in everything in our program, and this kid is really set up for some great future in so many ways, and whatever ways he decides to go into. So improving emotional intelligence has been shown to actually effectively prevent or treat depression, phobias, obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, anorexia and bulimia, the eating disorders, and even addictions such as alcoholism or technology addiction or those sorts of things. In fact, for those of you that are acquainted with the 12-step program, the 12-step program often will tell you that your first year of sobriety is going to be the worst year of your life. Because when you are not suppressing your frontal lobe with alcohol, because you've been so used to doing that, you're going to get into more stinking thinking. The way some people get rid of stinking thinking is they just drink alcohol, and that doesn't really, that just numbs it. It doesn't really correct their thoughts. But now they don't have they're not numbing it, and so they get into stinking thinking, and they'll be told you have to kind of wait a year. First year of sobriety is going to be the worst year of your life. But studies have shown that if you combine a 12-step program with a program that improves emotional intelligence, your first year of sobriety will actually be the best year of your life. It won't be the worst year, and of course it continues to get better after that. And it makes it far less likely, in fact the studies show, makes it 4 times less likely you'll ever go back to alcohol when you start correcting that stinking thinking up front. And so this is crucially important. We had speaking of that, just thinking of another example, I always think of individuals who have gone through our program. We had a local girl. By saying local, she came from the city of Auburn, which is just 8 minutes away. It's where the airport is that I flew out of to come here. And her parents, from the age of, starting at a teenager, 18 or 19, had put her through, I think, 8 different alcohol rehabs. Some of them 4 months, some of them 5 months. By the time she came to us, she was 30 years old and still had not been able to get over alcohol for more than a few months after leaving a program like that. And she had heard about our program just from being local. And she told her parents, "This is the program I want to go to." And they looked at the program and they said, 10 days? No way, you're going to go right back to alcohol. You can go back to it after 3 months, after a 4-month treatment program. 10 days? No, we're not sending you to that program. And she begged, and finally they said, well, nothing else has worked. And they also said, this isn't an alcohol rehab program, it's a depression and anxiety recovery program. Well, why do you think people use things like alcohol? It's actually a form of self-medicating. And so when she went through the program with the correcting of distorted thoughts and plus the spiritual aspect that improves the frontal lobe, she was able to get long-term success. And how long has it been, Erica, since she went through the program? Now she actually comes up and she's an assistant in helping other people through the program and works for us part-time, and it's been over a year now, and completely clean from alcohol and no desire to go back to it. And so this is what can happen when we start working on the emotional intelligence side of things. So increasing emotional intelligence has also been shown to help normal people. So it's not just for those with mental illness. It helps us to think clearer, helps us to communicate more effectively. It helps us to foster unity in group settings. It helps us to reduce polarizing statements. And it also promotes a happier life. And interestingly, all of this is accomplished without compromise or sacrificing the truth. One of the bedrock principles of emotional intelligence is it true? And it needs to be accurate and true. A lot of people think, well, the only way you can get to unity is if you put truth aside. Well, that's a very superficial unity that's going to explode very quickly. And if you really want to have bedrock unity, it has to be based on things that are true and accurate. And so many of the questions that we ask in regards to how we're thinking is it true? Is it helpful? And is it going to even help me achieve my goals? If it's wrong in any of those areas, there's some distortions behind it. And so the influences on emotional intelligence, our genetic makeup does have a role to play here as well. Talked a little bit about that last night. Some of us have more genetic challenges, and those mutations can play a role. Our childhood experiences, of course, can play a significant role in life. Our current level of emotional support plays a role. And then also physical conditions. If you haven't slept for 48 hours, what happens to your emotional intelligence? Does it go up or go down? It's going to go down. Poor nutrition has a role to play. Illness has a role to play. But for many, these factors are of less significance when compared with the next slide. And what studies have shown is our emotions are largely controlled by our what? Beliefs, our evaluation of events, the way we think about what? Problems, and our silent self-talk. These are the moment-by-moment messages we give ourselves. And so this is why it is important for us to actually listen to our thoughts. So I'm going to go into 3, if we have time, maybe 4 main stories this morning. But each of these stories will bring out a different cognitive distortion, a different distorted way, and we'll see thinking, what we call thinking errors, that actually produced some emotional consequences and help us to realize the importance of correcting this. The Bible tells us of a man who was tall, actually quite tall, and the Bible tells us this man was stunningly handsome. In fact, the Bible says that when he walked by with his height and his good looks, you couldn't help but gaze at him. He was easy on the eyes. On top of it, he was wealthy. And he also was well liked by the general public. By the way, there's a lot of the Hollywood stars that seem to have all 4 of those. But I've noticed in general with the Hollywood stars, they're only well liked by the people who don't know them. I went to medical school in Southern California, so I took care of a lot of those Hollywood stars. And as soon as the cameras stop flashing, they become some of the most despicable human beings to be around. There's a reason why they've had 7 divorces by the time they're 35, and it's due to them having low emotional intelligence. They have high IQ to memorize their lines, and they can really act out something that they're not at all, but they have significant emotional intelligence issues. But this man was not that way. This man was liked by the people who knew him. And one of the reasons why he was very well liked is he had a humble way about him, a transparent way. In fact, the Bible says Samuel met him, spent about an hour with him, and he began to love him like his own son. So this was a very likable guy. And on top of it, he was asked, he would have never run for the position because he was too humble a man, but he was actually asked to be the first king over God's chosen people, Israel. A lot of people think in retrospect, maybe God chose that king just to get back at Israel for wanting a king, because it wasn't God's plan that they do that. He made that clear as well, but they insisted. And of course, God believes in freedom of choice. And so Plan B was enacted. And this humble man that didn't even want to show up for his coronation, he was hiding in the baggage, came forward, and he became a great king for a couple of years. But then he began to run into significant issues emotionally. And research has documented that negative thoughts which cause emotional turmoil nearly always contain what? Gross distortions. The thoughts on the surface appear valid, but you will learn that they are irrational or just plain wrong, and that twisted thinking is a major cause of suffering. So let's take a look at Saul's thinking that might have brought this about. his distortion that was prominent was magnification and minimization. This is when we major in minors and minor in majors. And there's a number of mental illnesses that have this as a core feature. Obsessive compulsive disorder. It's not that you're prioritizing something that isn't important, but even something that's far more important you will neglect because of your focus on something of lesser importance. And there's also a significant issue. This distortion actually is significantly rising with a rise in certain types of personality issues, which are becoming more prominent today. But one of the things that Saul began to minimize is when he was confronted with his own guilt. There were times he was a human being. Any leader is going to make a mistake. And what happens then when you're confronted with the mistake? When Saul was confronted with his mistakes, he would minimize it and begin to justify himself. And Confucius, as a man who has committed a mistake and doesn't correct it, is doing what? Committing another mistake. And that another mistake is even worse than the first because you're doomed to repeat it. Now, I understand when you're a leader and everybody kind of knows what you're doing, that there's kind of defensive nature in regards to even the mistakes you make. But I've noticed, being a leader myself, that when you acknowledge your mistake, the people that are under you tend to be very forgiving when they see that you've done that and that you've learned from it and that you're not going to repeat it. But instead, Saul just justified himself and would minimize it. David Schwartz says, we can turn setbacks into victories. Find the lesson, apply it, and move on. Then look back on defeat and smile. And then he also started to dwell on the unfairness of his life. This actually had to do with the first thing, because he wasn't getting his issue and his mistakes, and Samuel kept saying, Saul, what is this that I hear? What is this that I'm seeing? You're actually not following the counsel. You're not doing things. And he'd say, why are you complaining? We actually won a battle. Why don't you talk about the things that were good instead of the things that weren't good? It began to minimize it in that way. And then finally, when he wasn't getting it, Samuel had to let him know that the kingdom was going to be taken away from his family. By the way, was that Samuel's punishment? Where did Samuel get that? Yeah, and God is a just God. But Saul viewed the punishment outweighing the crime. And he began to dwell on the unfairness. I've noticed a lot of people who dwell on the unfairness of their life are not always treated unfairly. And although they view it in that way because of the magnification, minimization aspect of things. And when we get into this mode where we're magnifying things out of proportion, we start getting into this idea that we can't stand things. Watch out for I can't stand-it-itis, because what's going to happen next is anger and rage and loss of temper. And Saul began to have this magnification that he couldn't stand certain things. Did you know there's only one thing a human being cannot stand? That's death. Everything else they actually can stand, but when they tell themselves they can't stand it, that's when emotions get out of control and significant a loss of temper, and we end up injuring ourselves more so than injuring others often when we have this retaliation mode. And we actually teach a song right at the beginning of our program. We actually have taught this to, I talked to you about the curriculum, the K through 4 curriculum. In Guam, we actually teach this starting in the first grade. It's a little song that says, I don't like it, I don't like it, it's okay, it's okay. I can stand it anyway, I can stand it anyway, I'm all right, I'm all right. And that song teaches you just because you don't like something doesn't mean you can't what? Doesn't mean you can't stand it. And so this is important also before their first hydrotherapy treatment of contrast hydrotherapy. And it actually helps several ways, physiologically as well as the mental view of those things. And they end up significantly enjoying hydrotherapy at the end, actually trying to pay the therapist under the table for another treatment. But when trials arise that seem unexplainable, we're told we should not allow our peace to be spoiled. However unjustly we may be treated, let not passion arise. By indulging a spirit of retaliation, who do we injure? We injure ourselves. We destroy our own confidence in God and can even grieve the Holy Spirit. The third aspect of his magnification has to do with the fact that although he started out a humble man, he became quite a proud individual. He developed this high self-esteem. Now you might say, how did a humble man become proud? Well, have you ever heard the phrase, power corrupts? What does absolute power do? It corrupts absolutely, and that's why God didn't want to have a king. This is one of the reasons I know today there's a lot of individuals politically that would like to have the monarch back, where they can take over the Supreme Court and be the head of that and be the head of the legislature and be the head of the executive branch, all in one portion of things. But our country was wise to recognize, wait a minute, you put someone in there, even if they're a good person like Saul, eventually power is going to corrupt. And absolute power is going to corrupt absolutely. And when everyone comes to you to know what to do next, you start developing this idea that maybe you're pretty important. And, when you're a king, people have to come to you to find out what to do next. And it became clear that people didn't quite recognize when this transition was occurring, because there was another battle that took place. And this was a serious one. And, back in those days, these battles were like ISIS. If Israel lost, their homes were taken over, their women were taken over, treated as slaves or worse. And so the women in particular are very interested in the outcomes of these battles, not only so that their husbands and fathers and brothers could come home, but the fact that they'd be able to keep their home and not be enslaved. And so when this battle was over with and it was clear that Israel had won, of course everyone wants to know the details. How did it happen? And it turns out there was this young man in the army by the name of David, who had been the all-star in that battle. And so the women heard about the story, and they designed this song so that when all the soldiers marched in, they would honor the all-star of the battle. Do you remember what the lyrics were to that song? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his what? Tens of thousands. Now, I must admit, had I been the choir director of those ladies that day and Saul's doctor, I would have advised them to change the lyrics. But they knew Saul as a humble man. This was the guy who didn't even want to be king. He was hiding in the baggage. He's been a great man. They thought that he would just put his arm around David and say, aren't we glad that God put him in the position to succeed? But when that song was sung, he wasn't sure he heard it right the first time. And the second time, he knew he heard it right, and his pride was wounded. And he began to think some very dark thoughts. By the way, before we get feelings of worthlessness is one of the primary hallmark symptoms of severe depression. And studies show before you ever experience feelings of worthlessness, you actually have set up an inflated sense of egotistical self that's been wounded, and then it swings the other way. And so this is why we need to be careful not to have magnification of self. By the way, there's a personality disorder that encompasses magnification of self. What do we call that? The narcissistic personality disorder. And that wasn't unique to Saul. In fact, this is one of the reasons why I wish in our own country we would get back to the way the founding fathers really wanted to elect a leader of the country. It worked, those first few presidents. Those presidents didn't actually run for president. George Washington did not want to be president. But the electoral system was put in place, and the electors said, you're not running for president, but you're the best man for the job. Please, not me. No, you're the best man for the job. But now, people that run for president actually have to be egotistical enough to say, I have everything that it takes to run this country. So we're selecting out a group of what? And so do we wonder why we have some emotional health issues in regards to our leaders, et cetera? But it's not just unique here in America as well. It's been around for a long time. Is not this great Babylon which I have built? Who was this? Nebuchadnezzar. Did he have emotional problems? Serious emotional problems. He would have rage. He would have insomnia. He would want to commit genocide on groups of people. And his problem was so severe, he was warned about it. Nebuchadnezzar, you think life is all about you. And you think the kingdom is all about you. And you're a pretty proud individual. And yeah, Nebuchadnezzar, it's very clear he had a high IQ. He did a lot of things wisely. He did things to help the economy. He did things that were quite good. But although he was warned about it, he heeded that warning for about 2 days. And then he went back into his pride and arrogance again. And his problems became more severe. It took more than a 10-day program. How long was Nebuchadnezzar's program? It was a 7-year program. And the first thing God did was put him on a plant-based vegetarian diet. And he put him on an exercise program. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar, if you're going to eat, you're going to have to exercise first. And he straightened out his circadian rhythms, his light, dark cycles. And he also gave him hydrotherapy, if you read the account. He also gave him music therapy, if you read the account. And then he got in to helping him correct his distorted thoughts about himself. Did the program work? It worked wonderfully. And Nebuchadnezzar fully recovered, and he became probably the greatest king, because now he had high IQ, but on top of it, he had very high EQ, and he had a humble view of himself in the world, even in charge of a world empire. And he may have become the greatest king. That's one of the reasons why he was allowed to write a chapter in the Bible after this. Actually, Daniel chapter 4 is not written by Daniel. It is Nebuchadnezzar's story of going through all of this. But it didn't start with him. I will exalt myself above the Most High. Lucifer, the distorted thoughts, magnification of himself, is what has caused a lot of the, if not all of the discord in the world. So we can look at individuals like that and say, yeah, they were narcissistic, and they should have corrected this. But there's a cognitive behavioral therapist by the name of William Backus. He's written a book called What Your Counselor Never Told You. And the subtitle of the book is The 7 Sins That Lead to Mental Illness. And the first sin that's mentioned that leads to mental illness in this book is the sin of pride. And then he gives you a test to see whether you might have it. Trying to be noticed, craving attention, itching for compliments, needing to be important, detesting the idea of being submissive, loathing the idea of admitting to any wrongdoing, strongly opinionated, being argumentative, demanding your way, wanting control over others, flaunting your individual rights, refusing advice, and although you are critical, very critical of a lot of the people around you and organizations and those things, you resent any criticism coming your way. Being oversensitive, and finally, thinking you have excellences you actually don't even have. William Backus says, watch out. If you have one or more than one of these, what's there? Pride. And what's going to follow? Wounded pride. And you are going to have some significant emotional issues. In contrast, we have other characters that had more justification for developing a sense of pride. Christ, who we're told was the creator of the world, was also never elated by applause. Why was he never elated by applause? Because he never allowed himself to develop an arrogant sense of self. He not only said the words, he lived the words, blessed are the what? Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the poor in spirit. And by the way, this was very much connected to another attribute. Nor was he dejected by censure or disappointment. This is why, even in the most cruel situation, the quote goes on, amid the greatest opposition and the most cruel treatment, he was still of what? Good courage, and even looking for a soul to win as he was being executed in the most painful and most prolonged, torturesome way. And so this is what's going to happen. If you're never elated by applause, you won't be dejected by censure or disappointment. Thomas Jefferson, the founder of the Democratic Party, says nothing gives one person so much advantage over another as to remain what? Cool and unruffled under what? All circumstances. You can't do this if you have magnification and minimization, if you have your priorities out of kilter. And so we need to have our priorities in accurate in their accurate place, and what a difference it can make. Well, when Saul underwent the recommended therapy for depression, he would feel better again. Do you remember what his recommended therapy was? Music therapy. Did it work? It did work. What type of music was it? Harp music. And that's actually been studied even today. It has been shown to be very healthy for the brain. There are certain advantages of harp music. One is you cannot play it too loud, no matter how hard you try. It's the softer melodies and harmonies. You also, it's very difficult to do the syncopated rhythm aspect of things. It's the more straight rhythms that help, the more consonant harmonies. And he was able to actually correct his thoughts with that type of music, helping him in the process. But he would only correct it for a short time. He never practiced correcting his distorted thoughts for more than a few days. And then, with the three causes still active, and the third cause, wounded pride, becoming even more prominent, he would slip back into anxiety and depression. Finally, under tremendous stress, when he was wanting to know what to do, the biggest battle yet, and he was asking God for counsel in the way he thought God should give him counsel. By the way, beware of asking God to answer you the way you demand he answer you. If he doesn't answer you like he didn't answer Saul, it may be because he's already answered you and you haven't been following his advice and counsel. But when Saul didn't get the answers he thought he should, he then went to the wrong counselors. He said, I've got to get counsel from somewhere. So he went to the wrong counselor, and that wrong counselor told him 95% truth and 5% error. The truth part was, Saul, you have messed up. And you have messed up big. The false part was, you have messed up so big, there is no hope for you anymore. Let me tell you, if there's life, there's hope. And there was hope for Saul even then. But now when he thinks there's no hope, and a tremendous stress comes into his life the next day, what does he do? He ends his life by suicide. And he actually induces another suicide right next to him. And this was an unnecessary death. Had he taken care of the issues that were behind in his thoughts, behind his emotional issues. The next case goes into emotional reasoning. Emotional reasoning is this: your feelings don't lie. Let me give you an example of an emotional reasoner. I feel overwhelmed and helpless, therefore my problems are impossible to solve. Is that true? If I feel overwhelmed and helpless, it doesn't mean my problems are impossible to solve. I'm angry at you, and that proves that you've been cruel and insensitive to me. Just the fact that I'm angry at you proves that you've been cruel and insensitive. Is that true? No. Or it can go the other way. I feel on top of the world, therefore I am invincible. Am I invincible because I feel on top of the world? No, we need to recognize our feelings can lie. And there was a prominent individual in the Bible who got into emotional reasoning. Emotional reasoners tend to get into quick fix ways of altering the way they feel. And he talked about getting into alcohol. He talked about getting into the drugs of the day. And whatever anyone was doing to have fun, he wanted to do it too. He said, "Go to now, I'll prove thee with mirth, therefore enjoy pleasure. Whatsoever mine eyes desired, I kept not from them. I withheld not my heart from any joy." And where did it lead him to? Therefore, I hated life for all its vanity and vexation of spirit. We went over this a little bit last night, lowering the dopamine set point. What was he doing in verse 10? What do we call that today? That he should have been keeping his eyes from, but he wasn't keeping them from. Anyone remember? What do we call that? I guess we don't want to say the word in church. But in Solomon's case, it was pornography, and it was live pornography, and it led him to hate life. Therefore, I went about to cause my heart to despair. We're told many envied the popularity and abundant glory of Solomon, thinking that of all men, he must be the what? The most happy. Why? He had the most money of anyone in the world. He also had the most beautiful woman from every ethnicity known to mankind at his beck and call. He had beautiful palaces. He had everything that was pleasing to the eye in front of him. And we're told amid all that glory of artificial display, the man envied is the one to be what? Most pitied. His countenance is dark with despair. All the splendor about him is but a mockery of the distress and anguish of his thoughts as he reviews his misspent life in seeking for happiness through what? Indulgence and selfish gratification of what? Every desire. We're told that by his own bitter experience, Solomon learned the emptiness of a life that seeks in earthly things its highest good. Gloomy and soul-harassing thoughts troubled him night and day. For him, there was no longer any joy of life or peace of mind, and the future was dark with despair. If there's no longer any joy of life possible, what is it that you're suffering from? Depression. If there's no longer any peace of mind, what are you suffering from? Anxiety. And so he had the severest forms of depression and anxiety, and it looked like the future was dark with despair. But you know, Solomon, there's been some modern day Solomons, and we could name them. Epstein, who wasn't envious of Epstein when they knew him. He owned his private islands and these Gulfstream jets and all of these sorts of things. But what a gloomy and soul-harassing mind he had. And the future, again, dark with despair. And there are others that we could name repeatedly by going the false ways of altering the way that we should feel. And that's why Solomon wrote the book Ecclesiastes, was to warn every young person not to go the route that he went. He went into the false ways of altering the way you feel. And I think I mentioned this last night. You can never get enough of what you what? Don't need, because what you don't need will never satisfy you. No one, by the way, how can you tell the difference between needs and wants? Just ask yourself this question: how long can I go without this before I die? If it doesn't affect that, it's a want. It is not a need. And I look at actually all the death certificates after the CDC allows us to. Every year I teach principles of health. I want to see what people are dying from. And in the U.S., you have to put cause of death and what caused this and what caused that and get down to the bottom cause of death. No one has ever signed a death certificate as lack of sex a cause of death. What does that mean? That means it is a want and not a need. And Solomon, got to the point where he thought it was a need. And that's why he could never get enough. Even 300 wives weren't enough. Even 1,000 concubines weren't enough. And this is unfortunately what happens in the pornographic world today, where all of this is very easy. Studies have shown, this was University of Indiana, University of Wisconsin, they did a randomized controlled trial. People have mentioned you can't do this trial today because this was a group that had never been exposed to pornography in college. This was a study in the late 1980s where you didn't have the internet and you didn't have all that. You could still view it, but you had to go somewhere and pay for it, and that inhibited a lot of people of actually being ever exposed to it. But there was 300 men and women that were exposed. Actually, they were randomized to either control group or exposure, so 150 exposed, 150 control. Where the control wasn't a great control, it was regular Hollywood movies and regular Hollywood magazines. But nonetheless, they looked at those two comparisons and found out the pornographic group less interested and less attracted to their partner if they had one, more self-absorbed. They began to have less empathy for others around them. They began to have a diminished ability to foresee consequences. So that means the gray matter in their frontal lobe is shrinking. And they began to shut down emotionally in just 6 weeks. More pleasure leads to less pleasure. And dopamine levels decline considerably. The limbic system is revived and the amygdala becomes more powerful, so you're being controlled by your lower brain instead of your upper brain. And then hypofrontality occurs where the willpower erodes significantly. Dr. Zillman said the negative effects of pornography and or masturbation on emotional intelligence have been more consistently proven than the links between what? Smoking and lung cancer. Smoking and lung cancer, the links have been consistently proven. But his point is there's something that's even more scientifically sound in regards to the data and what this does to emotional intelligence and what it does to the brain. There was a reason why, I'd like to remind a lot of Christians have issues in this area. But in Acts chapter 15, the Jerusalem Council came together to see what things in the Old Testament Mosaic Code apply to Christians today. And there were 3 things that they came forward with. 2 of them had to do with diet, and the third one was about the laws of sexual morality. And those laws of sexual morality stated that you shouldn't be viewing individuals without clothes on. There's all of these rules inhibited. That's why we have our laws today, that you can't go out in public and do that way. But how is it that you're not allowed to go in public, but you can take a picture of yourself that way and disseminate it everywhere and have people view it? We shouldn't be surprised that these adverse effects occur. That was only to occur in an intimate, committed relationship, which would have a far different effect. A lecture for another time. So, research in the last couple of our last 20 years show the frontal lobe. This is a depressed person, their SPECT scan. You can see the marked recovery in the same brain after the depression is gone, and the biggest before and after difference there is in the gray matter of the frontal lobe. And this is why we need to get rid of habits that suppress the frontal lobe and participate in habits that enhance it. And that can have a great benefit in emotional intelligence. James says no one should say God tempts, because God doesn't tempt anyone. Each one is tempted when he is dragged away and enticed by his own what? Evil feelings. And what have we learned about feelings today? Feelings can lie. There's another song we have. Feelings come and feelings go, and feelings are deceiving. Trust alone on the word of God, it's something worth believing. So, Thomas Jefferson also, or Jonathan Martinson first, says feelings are much like waves. We can't stop them from coming, but we can what? Choose which one to serve, based on the one that's true and accurate. And then Thomas Jefferson says, don't bite at the bait of pleasure until you are sure there is what? No hook beneath. This would save us all sorts of trouble in this world if we would not emotionally reason. By the way, before we get to case 3, Solomon turned his life around. And if there's hope for Solomon, there's hope for anyone that has suppressed their frontal lobe through bad habits to turn their life around. And it is possible. It wasn't easy, but it did happen. And it was actually as a result of a prophet coming to Elijah, or not Elijah, but Solomon, and then him also being intelligent enough to view, I think I did this to myself, because I didn't used to be this way. I think I did this to myself, and then changing their habits. Case 3. He himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a juniper tree and requested for himself that he might, what? Die. And said, it is enough, O Lord. Take away my life. Who is it that wanted to die? This was Elijah. Now, was Elijah like Solomon, where he was just out there doing a bunch of fun things that weren't healthy? No. Was he like Saul, where he had developed this big arrogant sense of self? No, he was a humble man. He was a good man. And this tells us that emotional health problems can happen even to very good people who are even on a very pretty good lifestyle. Elijah had had this Mount Carmel experience, amazing experience. He thought it would change the nation. And within a day, his life was being threatened. Instead of being commended and saying, let's go Elijah's way, the leader of the country said, you're going to be dead in 24 hours. So he took off to save his life. And 30 days later, he's asking that his life be taken. He had fallen into severe depression. And when Elijah was depressed and wanted to die, the Lord came to him and asked him a 4-word question. What doest thou here? And this is what we asked anyone that comes to our program. How is it that you've needed to come here? How is it that you're feeling this way? What has been going on in your life? And before that, before the CBT portion of things, they had been trying to get Elijah to do the behavioral parts of things. They were trying to get him out of that dark cave. You need to be out in the light, Elijah. You need light to help you through depression. Exercise was part of it. Even nutrition was part of it. The angel came and fed him meal. It was a great meal, we're told. I'm sure there was some flaxseed in that meal, and omega-3 and tryptophan and all of those sorts of things we're going to be talking about tonight that can make a huge difference. But what finally made the difference was the cognitive behavioral therapy, and it was clear that Elijah even though he was a good man, was thinking distorted thoughts. He was overgeneralizing. This is what smart people tend to do, because your IQ test is based on your ability to generalize. But when you can generalize well, you have a tendency to overgeneralize. That means you hold the hypothesis as a fact rather than just a hypothesis, or generalizing from too few instances. Precisely what it is holding with limited, actually believing something that is not true based on limited factual evidence. So you have limited factual evidence, you firmly believe it, but it's not true. What is it that Elijah believed that wasn't true? I'm the only one that hasn't bowed the knee to Baal. He might have said, I'm the only one I know of. But instead, he just said he was the only one. And he knew that was true. He said it once. God let him get by with it because he was getting the whole story. And then he said it again. And then he had to be corrected and say, Elijah, you're not just a little bit wrong. How much wrong was he? 7,000 times wrong. And then Elijah was told to do 3 things that he did not want to do. And he couldn't figure out why God was telling him to do those 3 things. By the way, when we have people with severe depression and anxiety, most of the stuff we tell them, they're very willing to do. But in just about every individual, it's like, wait a minute, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do that. And I don't want to do this. I know the data shows it's going to be healthy for me, but I don't want to do it. How well do you think those individuals do? Elijah didn't want to do it, but he said, you know what? God's telling me, and so I'm going to do it, even though I don't want to. Did he recover? He fully recovered. And he ended up establishing the school of the prophets and was translated without seeing death. The individual that's in heaven that never died is actually a person who wanted to die because they were so severely depressed on this earth. What does that tell us about God's mercy and compassion for mental illness? He has tremendous mercy and compassion for those who are having mental health struggles. And he wants them to get to the core of the issue. And the individual translated without seeing death was precisely one of those individuals. We're told even the thoughts must be brought in subjection to the will of God, and the feelings under the control of reason and religion. Our imagination was not given us to be allowed to run riot and have its own way without any effort at restraint and discipline. If the thoughts are wrong, what else will be wrong? The feelings will be wrong. The thoughts and feelings combined make up the moral character. Once again, we're transformed by the renewing of our mind. And then once we renew it, we need to continue to practice it. This is why we have people develop 3x5 cards of their corrected thoughts. We actually don't tell them to put on the other side their distorted thoughts. Those they have. They don't need to review those. We need to block those pathways. But in the place of it, we have their corrected thoughts. And it's something that we have them go through a couple of times a day so that they get those new pathways in having that mind transformed. An ordinary mind, well-disciplined, will accomplish more and higher work than will the most highly educated mind and the greatest talents without what? Self-control. Well, I'll tell you about a recent case. Her name is Christy. She's an RN. She's told her case publicly, and so she's allowed me to tell her case. This was a woman that came to us after her 5th serious suicide attempt. Her 4th one, she went in the backyard and pointed a gun to her head, pulled the trigger, and the trigger jammed. She called her boyfriend and her father, and they came over, and the boyfriend actually was able to get the trigger to work pretty easily. And he didn't know why it had jammed. She went to a psych institution for quite a while after that and got out and then used another technique that normally works very well that I won't tell because it's more painless. And she checked herself into a Motel 6. She's an ICU nurse, so she knows how these drugs work. But it was obviously utilizing a drug in a particular way. And it was a Motel 6, so I guess they don't get in the rooms that often. I don't know. But she was there for 3 days on the floor in one place where she had developed bed sores even, and was finally found as she woke up. And after that, her mother heard about the program and brought her to us. She was on a number of antidepressants, on benzos as well. She was on, she didn't want to have anything to do with spiritual things. Her parents had told her that this was a spa-type experience that she could go to. And you know, it is a spa, it's in a beautiful setting, and there is a water park called the hydrotherapy section. But it's not quite, you know, your Hawaiian or, you know, a spa. And then when she realized the spiritual, she didn't want to have anything to do with God at all. And so it was quite a task to keep Christy even there that first week. Although she was raised in a religious home, she had rebelled against it. And in her first year of college, where she had gone to a Christian school, and she was talked to about the dress code that was there. And so she began to live her own life. And of course, that went to alcohol and then a lot of bad relationships with men to get her into this significant situation. Despite that, she was able to become an RN, but with her lifestyle began to get severely depressed. And I won't, and also the anxiety was very much there. And to even do her RN work, she needed to take stimulants. And so to focus, and then the stimulants would rev her up, and then she'd need benzos and also opioids. So, you know, it gives you an idea of, unfortunately, there are far more people out there like that than you might imagine, particularly in at all age groups. But they will end up with more relationships problems. She also had a child, and then a divorce, and after being sober for 6 years, she had started it up again, and that's when her fourth suicide attempt occurred, was actually under the influence of alcohol, and her fifth as well. So let me the first thing Christy noticed is that she thought she didn't fit in at Weimar. And we asked her, why do you think you don't fit in? And she says, well, I don't see any of the staff with tattoos. And, you know, so, you know, I have all these tattoos, so I don't fit in. Well, our program director said, should I show her my tattoo? And I said, no, this isn't about tattoos. You don't need to show that you've got them too. And so we kept having to help to reframe her thoughts as she wanted to go home. She would find a reason not to go to group sessions because of her social phobia aspect of things. And even at the cafeteria, she would take her food and then try to run. And of course, we needed to wean her off her benzos during this time to get her frontal lobe gap. The time came for the burning, where she made some significant commitments. Commitment to give up nicotine, which was a big one. Commitment to actually change her diet and become plant-based, which was very big for her. And a commitment to change her relationship with men. But the day after that, the halfway through point, she was ready to go home. And we kind of had a crisis at that point because she had called for a taxi and she says, I'm done. And we were only 7 days in. And I said, Christy, I can't let you go home. She says, I thought this is a volunteer program. And I said, it is a volunteer program until it becomes not voluntary. And I said, what are you going to do? I'm going to check myself into a local hotel. I said, we know what you do when you check into local hotels. And we can't let you do this. Well, then you need to send me to a psych ward. She goes, I'll fit in over there. And I said, you've been through that multiple times. Do you really want to go to that psych ward? So eventually, she decided she was going to stay. We had people outside her room that actually our staff volunteered to alternate. So if they heard anything going on in the room, they would go in. But she slept that entire night, and the next night she was very cooperative for the last 3 days. But still, she had only been on the 3-day program and not the 10-day program. And when I reevaluated her the day before discharge, I said, yeah, you're not suicidal. Yeah, you can go home, but I would advise you stay. She says, I'll think about it. The next morning, she wanted to go and leave. And we didn't know about it then, but she told us it was because she had a date with a guy to honor when she came back from that program, and she didn't want to miss that date. But she was doing some of the things. She had quit smoking. She was exercising again. But then she just became convicted. I know I'm not where I need to be. I need to go back there. And so she asked to come back, and we allowed her to come back. And this time, she came back the very next week, even though we didn't have a program, but we were able to work with her. And it took us about 2 weeks after that. And I evaluate her, and I say, Christy, do you think you're ready to go home now? She says, I want you to tell me, because I don't trust myself. I said, Christy, you're able to go. You are ready for discharge, and you're going to do well. I know you're going to be able to put this all into practice. Tears came to her eyes, and she says, I was hoping you'd tell me I couldn't go home. I love this place. I love everything about Weimar. And I love the spiritual part as well. The nurse began to study more of the word with her. And before she left, she wanted to be baptized at Moses Rock, where that transpired. But what a difference in Christy since that time. You can see a picture over there. But Christy, since she got home, she lives in Texas. She has been given new position after new position, management, raises, doing very well. And despite working full-time in management positions in healthcare now, which she was never able to do before, and because of her empathy and sympathy for others, she also is taking her doctorate in psychiatric nurse practitioner because she says, I think I'll save more lives in the psychiatric world than I will in a medical ICU. And she actually still comes back and is our nurse at times, so you might meet Christy and hear her story. And now she doesn't have that agoraphobia and all of that. She's still reserved, but yet a very engaging young woman. And what a difference it can make. Her emotional intelligence has gone from the bottom to the top. And it can be improved upon. I will close with the words of Christ himself, who said this, ye shall what? Know the truth. And that means not just a knowledge of it, but it's what you're thinking moment by moment, day by day. It's true and accurate. Christy, we'll tell her story, and she tells the story as part of it as well. Last time she told her story, I didn't tell you what happened that time when she was going to leave. I did tell you a little bit, but she actually also threatened to sue us at that point and said, I'm going to get my attorney involved. This was a voluntary program, and you're keeping me against my will. I'm going to get an attorney involved. I actually called her next of kin, which was her parents up at that point. And fortunately, they were supportive. They said, Dr. Nedley, you do whatever is possible to keep that woman there, because we know that's what she needs, everything that you're giving in that program. And so, but now when she hears that story, she will just be so embarrassed when it comes to the attorney part. She says, I am so sorry. You guys are the greatest people in the world. But she also says this, I don't even know who that other girl was. I am so different now. I know I was like that, but I really don't. I don't even know who that girl is. That's the type of transformation she has had, because she thinks truthful thoughts, moment by moment, day by day. Ye shall know the truth, and what will be the result? The truth shall set you free.